In August 1997, an unidentified man called The Howard Stern Show, claiming to be a serial killer who had murdered 12 women in New Orleans. During the 17-minute call, he spoke about himself and his crimes in an eerily calm and relatively convincing manner, describing the specific details about the murders and his motives behind them. But was the call a prank or a genuine confession? Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries and generally disturbing content, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. If you're interested in supporting the channel, you can become a Ko-fi member or a channel member to access uncut videos and other perks, or you can leave me a tip by clicking the thanks under this video. Thanks to anyone who considers this. The Howard Stern Show is an American radio show hosted by Howard Stern, Robin Quivers, and Fred Norris that began airing in 1981 and is still running to this day. The show covers a range of different topics and often features guests and callers. It's known for its dark humour, and there have been a number of controversies over the years, most of which related to comments Howard himself has made, from insensitive jokes about victims of the Columbine school shooting the day after it happened, to calling Anna Nicole Smith a heavy-set woman and repeatedly asking her to weigh herself on the show. One controversial event that is certainly not unheard of, but not as well known as you might expect given the nature of it, was a call that was taken on the 13th of August 1997. Howard introduced the man by saying that he has a guy on the phone who's claiming he's been killing prostitutes and he's wondering why he's doing it. The man refers to himself as Clay and said he's killed 12 sex workers before explaining that he likes the sense of power it gives him. Howard asks him a number of questions and manages to find out quite a few details about Clay and his crimes. He's actually quite smart in the way he tries to extract information from Clay, as in addition to asking direct questions, he'll make assumptions and also seemingly intentionally recall details already mentioned wrong, hoping that Clay will correct him and give him even more information, which he does. For example, right off the bat, Howard introduces him as Ed, and Clay says that's not his name, giving Howard an opportunity to ask what his name is. Obviously, Clay won't be his real name, but this is a technique that Howard uses successfully throughout, and I think spliced in between the direct questions, it makes it feel like less of an interrogation, almost tricking Clay into revealing perhaps more than he initially intended to. Anyway, Howard manages to find out the following details about Clay himself. He lives and committed most of the murders in New Orleans. He's white. He has children, but he's not married to their mother. He likes comic books and Batman. He has taken acid a few times, but he has only been under the influence of alcohol while committing some of the murders. And he has no tattoos. As for the murders, Clay claims that he was 16 when they started, and that he strangled one of his victims and used a hammer to kill most of the others. 2 of them occurred in a parking garage, and the rest of them by the side of the road. It sounds like all but one took place in New Orleans, with the exception of the second victim in one night, who Clay killed in Mississippi. Most of his victims were black, and when Howard asks if there is a racial motivation, he implies that there isn't. It was just a case of opportunity, because he never approached them in the first place, they approached him. He sometimes has intimate contact with them before murdering them, not every time, but always pays them and always makes sure they keep the money. For one of the victims, who he says he initially didn't realise was a man, he quote, "put the money in a compromising place." He often makes his victims aware that they are going to die before he takes their lives. Sometimes he'll start by asking them if they think what they're doing is dangerous, and they laugh it off, and this pisses him off. He did decide against murdering a couple of the women who approached him, one of whom seemed to be new to the work. He noted she had an innocent quality and reminded him of his ex-fiancée. Clay stated that it had been nearly a year since his last kill, and when asked why, he said part of it had to do with his car breaking down, so he couldn't do so for a month, and he's had self-control since then, but still wants to murder women. When asked if anyone ever came close to catching him, he says no, but when one of the murders was in the newspaper, someone joked and said, "I know it was you," to him. Throughout the call, Howard attempts to dig into Clay's psyche and figure out why he does this. He initially assumes that Clay had issues with his mum, or that his mum was a sex worker, and Clay denies this. He also says he was never abused himself. He asks him if he ever harmed animals when he was younger, and Clay says only once, when he killed a rat. Aside from saying he likes the sense of power and mentioning that he gets bored, he says he doesn't really know why he kills people. Towards the end of the call, Howard also gets a psychologist on the line who asks Clay if he wet the bed when he was younger, to which he replies that he didn't. When asked if he started fires, he said he did. These behaviours are two of the three factors that can occur in childhood in the McDonald triad, also known as the homicidal triad, which are considered to be associated with violent tendencies and often serious crimes like murder. The other factor is cruelty to animals, which doesn't really apply to Clay, meaning arson is the only relevant trait. While the triad is applicable to some violent offenders, there isn't enough evidence to suggest that it can reliably predict that a child will go on to commit violent crimes as an adult, as not all children who display these behaviours do, and not all violent criminals displayed these behaviours as children, like Clay. Regardless, these factors are not really relevant in determining why Clay did what he did, as they're seen as criteria to predict future behaviour, not an explanation behind crimes like murder. When the psychologist is asked why Clay murders, he just says that he must have a lot of anger and it's probably something to do with his family, both points that were already discussed, so he doesn't end up providing any useful insight into Clay's behaviour. Howard goes on to question what he can do about the call. It's not like he can turn Clay in because he has no idea who he is, so he decides to hang up. Howard, Robin, and another man in the background imply that they are convinced Clay was being truthful before moving on to the next segment. Howard never publicly spoke about the call after this. The FBI reportedly spoke with Howard after hearing about this call. Apparently they thought the call could be genuine because Clay knew details about the murders that hadn't been released publicly. This would imply that they knew exactly which murders he was confessing to, though that information hasn't been shared. Clay mentioned in the call that a black police officer had been arrested for some of the murders he committed, and it's been speculated that this might be the information the FBI were referring to, but that's unlikely. Unless Clay had a job in law enforcement himself and so had insider knowledge of the suspects, he likely learned of the arrest in the news. I think the information was probably that he left cash for one of the victims in a compromising place, as that is a detail that someone falsely confessing to a crime wouldn't typically guess, so police would know they were dealing with the real killer. In addition to the details Clay volunteered about himself, there are a number of assumptions we can make if we read between the lines. We can probably narrow down the type of work he's in. He said his car broke down and that prevented him from killing for a month, suggesting he likely isn't very well off. I'm not sure why someone would wait a month to get their car fixed if they had the money to fix it straight away. This also implies that his car isn't necessary for his job, so we can probably rule out a taxi driver, delivery driver, or anything along those lines. Furthermore, I assume that he works close to where he lives and that his workplace is accessible by walking or public transport. He mentioned that he once killed a rat in the kitchen at work. Perhaps he meant the staff canteen, but this could alternatively suggest he works in a restaurant or cafe, assuming he hasn't changed jobs since. The call occurred on a weekday during normal business hours, implying that Clay either doesn't work a normal 9-to-5 job and was at home when he made the call, or he was at work and he works alone in a job that he can get away with taking some time out to make a call, as he didn't seem in a rush to end it. I wonder why he even chose to make the call that day. He hadn't murdered anyone in nearly a year. Was this day significant to him, or was the urge creeping back in, and this was a way to relive the crimes and satisfy the urge in an attempt to stop himself killing again? I'm terrible at identifying British accents, never mind American, but a few people have pointed out that Clay's accent isn't from New Orleans or Louisiana, so perhaps he moved there from a different state, if he isn't lying about where he's committing the murders. A few things Clay said makes me wonder if he's physically not very big, either short in height or not well built. He talks about the power aspect of the murders, not to say that a bigger man wouldn't also like the sense of power, but psychologically speaking, particularly men who feel physically or mentally weak will seek out situations that make them feel powerful to counteract this. He strangled one victim and then used a hammer on the rest. Could this be because he struggled with the strangulation because he's not physically strong and so found it easier to use a weapon? He said himself that he wasn't powerful when he was 16. Perhaps he bulked up since then, or his body type stayed the same, but now he uses a weapon, he feels bigger because he's able to take a life easier. I would lean towards Clay being politically right-wing, as he's a white man, presumably working a blue-collar job, with some kinda conservative views. For example, he clearly has a problem with sex workers. He referred to the victim, who was presumably trans, as it, suggesting contempt. He doesn't have tattoos and said he wouldn't do that to himself, and he was raised in a religious household. I'd be willing to bet that his ex-fiancée and presumably mother of his children broke up with him and that he's still in love with her, considering he said he let one woman go because she reminded him of her. I think all the details that he revealed about himself, and the ones that can be inferred, are enough for someone, somewhere, to identify him, especially considering we know what his voice sounds like too. There's someone out there that jokingly said to their friend that they knew he was a serial killer, and if that person heard this call, that could be all it takes for Clay to be identified, and if he really is a murderer, convicted. All that said, it's probably worth bearing in mind that Clay likely threw in a few red herrings to not make himself too identifiable. He likes the thrill of the chance of getting caught, but he doesn't actually want to get caught. Obviously, we have no idea which parts are true and which are red herrings, and this makes it difficult to speculate, but if the story about his friend joking with him is true, I think it would be quite easy for them to figure out it's him. So we've spent some time analysing the call and the person who made it, but was it even legit, or was it a hoax of some kind? As far as anyone's aware, Clay has never been caught, and if he has, he never confessed to making this call, so it's impossible to know for sure whether or not it's real. We can only speculate. It's a very dividing question when this call is discussed on Reddit and elsewhere, with some totally convinced it was real, including Howard, and others believing it was a hoax. I'm not 100% convinced, but I think there is a decent chance it's legit based on the things Clay says and his demeanour throughout. This just doesn't really feel like an obvious prank call to me. It's graphic enough without being overly sensationalised. Clay doesn't seem to be trying too hard to make himself sound like a psychopath, and his answers to Howard's questions are quite fluent, yet not so fluent that it sounds like he's reading from a script. It doesn't seem like he's trying to convince them he's genuine, it comes across like he's making the call for his own benefit and doesn't really care what people think. He also corrects Howard on a couple of details throughout. For example, he tells them he was 16 when he committed his first murder, and later Howard gets it wrong and says that his first victim was 16, and he says no, he was 16 when he did it. This shows that his story is pretty consistent throughout, and it makes sense that he'd be more bothered about correcting them if he was telling the truth, because this actually matters to him. Presumably, he made the call in the first place either to brag about his crimes, or for the thrill of putting himself in the spotlight so that he's risking getting caught. It's all quite personal to him. This is his legacy in some messed up way, so he doesn't want them getting details wrong. He never breaks character and remains calm throughout, but there are a few moments where he seems a little anxious. You can hear his breathing, or perhaps him taking a drag of a cigarette, and his voice sounds a little shaky at times. Some of the answers just don't seem like things that would be made up on the spot or planned. For example, when Clay is asked why he hasn't killed for a year, he says because his car broke down. Out of any reason that a prank caller could have given, it seems like quite an obscure one to come up with. The same can be said for his claims of always making sure the victims are paid and leaving the money he gave one of the victims in a compromising place. These are just unusual details for a prank caller to make up. We could analyse his behaviour all day, and overall, I believe it to be quite convincing, but ultimately it doesn't prove anything. Some people are good actors and good at improvising and think outside the box, so the fact that he doesn't sound like a typical prank caller doesn't mean that he isn't. It's impossible to say one way or the other. I wasn't able to find a statement that came directly from the FBI, but sources report that they claimed Clay knew details about some murders that hadn't been publicly released. And if that's true, it all but confirms that Clay was in fact a murderer. If this call was legit, it wouldn't be the first time that a serial killer has made an appearance in the media. The Zodiac Killer was known to send letters to the press, and someone claiming to be him spoke with talk show host Melvin Belli on live TV in October 1969, though there are doubts that this man really was the Zodiac Killer. Jack the Ripper, the Axeman of New Orleans, and Todd Kohlhepp all sent letters to local newspapers too. Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, sent a floppy disk to a local television station in 2005, and this actually led to his arrest, as it was traced to a computer at the church he attended. So while it is a rare occurrence, it's not beyond the realm of possibility that Clay really is a serial killer and got a kick out of appearing on the Howard Stern show. When this event was discussed on Reddit, users started looking for unsolved murders that could match the details that Clay gave in the call. They came across the Storyville Slayer, which according to Wikipedia is the nickname given to an American serial killer who murdered at least 24 prostitutes and drug addicts, most of whom were women, in New Orleans, Louisiana. Through the course of the investigation, 2 separate suspects were considered, one of whom was convicted of one murder, leading investigators to believe that multiple killers are responsible. There are a number of similarities between these murders and the murders that Clay claims to have committed. For example, most of the victims were black women and sex workers. Some of the bodies weren't found for a significant period of time. The murders stopped in 1996, which would have been roughly a year before the call, so around the time Clay said his last murder was. And perhaps most damning, it was announced in a press conference in 1995 that the current prime suspect was 33-year-old Victor Gant, a black police officer. Clay said in the call that a black police officer had been arrested for some of the murders he committed. Victor apparently matched the description given by one of the victims who survived, so it seems likely that either he or someone who resembled him were responsible for this attempted murder, but perhaps Clay was behind others. How many other unsolved cases in the New Orleans area at the time lined up with so many details that Clay gave? Either Clay is responsible for some of these murders, or these murders were the inspiration behind his prank call. In addition to Victor Gant, there was another suspect on the FBI's radar, Russell Elwood. He was actually convicted of one of the murders and sentenced to life in prison without parole in 1999. Despite speculation, it's highly unlikely that Clay and Russell were the same person, because the call was made on the 13th of August, and from the 4th of August, Russell was in prison serving an 85-day sentence for unrelated drug charges. However, if Russell only murdered one person, or wasn't actually responsible for any of the murders and Clay was, the timing of the call could give Clay some credibility if he thought that Russell would be getting credit for the murders he committed. Not all of the details match up, as most of the victims of the Storyville Slayer were strangled. There's no mention of a hammer being used at all, although this could have been one of the red herrings that Clay gave so he wasn't identified. If Clay murdered anyone, the most likely scenario seems to be that he was responsible for the 12 he admitted to, and Russell and/or other people were responsible for the rest. Of course, it is entirely possible that this was nothing more than a prank call. Perhaps Clay heard about the details of the Storyville Slayer murders in the news, and that's where he got the idea from. Maybe he thought it was funny, or perhaps it was a fantasy for him, and he got off on the idea of people thinking he was a serial killer. As I said earlier, although numerous sources claim that the FBI stated Clay knew details about the murders that only the culprit would know, I haven't actually heard that straight from the horse's mouth, so I can't verify it, which is unfortunate as that would definitely determine one way or the other if this call was genuine. The Howard Stern Show has received various calls from people over the years who claim to have committed crimes and done other bad things, and at least some of these were likely hoaxes, perhaps this call included. Some have even speculated that Howard faked the call himself to boost ratings, or at least that the producers of the show faked it and didn't tell him at the time so his reaction would seem more genuine. I'm not sure if the fact he hasn't spoken about the call since would support that theory or the possibility of it being genuine, as he likely wouldn't want to be scrutinised if he knew it wasn't real, but if it was, it makes sense that the FBI might have told him not to discuss it. If the call was real, I can only hope Clay decided to stop murdering people, but it's unlikely that he was ever caught, as a serial killer who had 12 victims would have been big news, so it's really sad that the hypothetical victims never got justice. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the call was genuine or a prank call, or do you think it was all a hoax set up by Howard? If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my Ko-fi members and channel members whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.